Hello and welcome. My name is Bill Rosart, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the University of Calgary's Schulich School of Engineering. Welcome to our second Schulich Connects of the 2021-2022 academic year, Sustainable Cities. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region here in Southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today's Schulich Connect will be a very timely conversation as we've just went through a municipal election. Many people are looking to the future and the things we can do to make our community even better. Sustainability is interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary, and it's even transdisciplinary. Sustainability solutions will require bringing diverse groups of people together. We know engineers will also need to step up and be part of the teams at the forefront of creating our sustainable future today. I know today's moderator and panel will leave you feeling inspired for what's to come and also reflecting on what more we need to do as individuals and as a community. We will have question and answers throughout the session. So if you have any questions at any time, type them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar, and our moderator will be going through as many as possible. We are recording this session and we'll be making it available to view in the coming days. Sustainability is core to the Schulich School of Engineering and the University of Calgary. In fact, it's Sustainability Week here at the university, highlighted by the 2021 Institutional Sustainability Report, which was released yesterday. The Institutional Sustainability Report is a comprehensive look at some of the amazing work that is being done at the University of Calgary to create a sustainable future for everyone. Within the Schulich School of Engineering, all 6 of our departments are invested in the importance of sustainability. We are the home of a federally funded research and training program focused on integrated infrastructure for sustainable cities. And soon, we will be the home of a new engineering undergraduate program, Sustainable Systems Engineering, which is being developed by sustainability leaders from not just across the Schulich School of Engineering, but also with input from teams across the entire university. This new interdisciplinary major is planned to be launched in fall 2022. Stay tuned for more details on this exciting new option for Schulich students. I am very happy now to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jocelyn Hayley. Dr. Hayley is a professor and department head of the Schulich School of Engineering's Department of Civil Engineering. Jocelyn holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a PhD in geotechnical engineering and joined the University of Calgary in 2001 after a postdoctoral fellowship at the prestigious Norwegian Geotechnical Institute in Oslo, Norway. She became department head in 2018 after 3 years as Senior Associate Dean Research here at Schulich. She has been involved in many projects over her career and won numerous awards while continuing to conduct high impact research. I'm now pleased to hand the podium over to Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this Schulich Connect session. Sustainability is really important to me. It's something I'm both professionally and personally passionate about. On the professional side, my research group works with a network across Canada to quantify and understand the impacts of climate change on permafrost in Arctic regions, something that greatly affects the sustainability of the infrastructure that both houses and connects our northern communities. Personally, I try to bring sustainability into my daily life, and I'm always looking for ways to learn, to grow, and to connect in this area. That's why I'm so much looking forward to hearing from our panel today. So let me introduce you to the four people who are with us today to talk about this really important topic. First, we have Dr. Lena Catan. Lena is a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering. She's also the Urban Alliance Professor in Transportation System Optimization and the leader of the CREATE program that Bill mentioned, this federally funded program. Its title is Integrated Infrastructure for Sustainable Cities. Her research focuses on a wide array of transportation and traffic analysis and applications. And in addition to numerous awards, she's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. Welcome, Lena. Next, we have Chris Arthurs, who is the General Manager of the Deputy Cities Manager's Office and City Resilience Officer within the City of Calgary. Chris is a UCalgary alumna who holds a Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Environmental Design Planning. She has 26 years of diverse experience across many business units and departments in the City of Calgary. Most notably, she helped to establish the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, and she was the Director of Recovery Operations following the 2013 flood. Welcome, Chris. Next, we have Jennifer Masick, who is the President and CEO of Magna Engineering Systems. She's an alumna of the Schulich School of Engineering from 2002, and she has over 20 years of environmental and civil engineering experience in the municipal infrastructure field in both rural and urban environments across Western Canada. She has a unique perspective on how technical designs and requirements impact the municipal environment. Her main goal in recent years is supporting municipalities with long-term sustainable growth through the use of naturalized infrastructure in the fields of stormwater and wastewater. Jennifer also served as a city councillor in Chestermere from 2013 to 2017. Welcome, Jennifer. And finally, we're really pleased to have the City of Calgary Ward 9 Councillor, John Carlo Carra, joining us. First elected to council in 2010, Councillor Carra is another UCalgary graduate, holding a bachelor's in history and a master's in environmental design. He's a community activist who is always concerned with the interaction between human societies and the physical environment. He also believes empowered communities drive a city to achieve success and is hoping to continue his work after winning his fourth term in the recent municipal election. Welcome, John Carlo. I'm so excited to have our panel all together today. And to get our panel warmed up and our audience warmed up, I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists a question. And I'd like you to just take 1 to 2 minutes to just describe how you came to be passionate about sustainability. So Jennifer, I'm going to start with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. You know, I always say the easy answer would be, well, I took an environmental engineering degree, so I've always been passionate about it. But that wouldn't be true. The reality is, in my early 30s, I became a single parent in a really affluent community. And what that meant was I had 2 small children, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and the community hadn't taken the step yet to look at it from the perspective of someone that needed to take 2 little kids on a tricycle and a stroller to the grocery store to get food. And so that's really what did it for me, kind of entered the world of politics about that same time, and to really be able to look at the world through the eyes of everyone in the community. And to me, that's what sustainable community looks like. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's just fabulous. John Carlo, how did you become passionate about sustainability?
Well, I mean, I think I'd have to sort of point to my history degree as being really the first step in that direction. When you take a historical perspective about the world, you realize that the project of human civilization is a series of emergences and a series of declines spread across regions across the world. And my question, of course, as we become more and more of a global society and we become much more, our technical abilities impact ecosystem, the biosphere that we live in, the conversation about emerging and declining as civilizations becomes an existential question about the continued survival of human civilization. And so I was always very interested in that. And then when I had my urban design epiphany, taking an urban design theory course at the Faculty of Environmental Design, now the School of Architecture, Landscape and Planning at the University of Calgary, I realized there were actual professions where you could take that trans and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to really tackling how we survive and thrive long into an uncertain future. And so I guess the answer is, I guess it's my training and my passion, and who knows.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Fabulous to hear about how you come about it. Lena, you lead this big program, which crosses our university as well as right across Canada in terms of the CREATE program. But tell us, even before that, how you personally became interested in sustainability.
Yeah, so I'm always think about sustainability as in terms of, I say, question of morality and ethics. Like, it's the right thing to do, right? Like, because realizing that whatever we do, somehow in a way or another, it affects other people, sometimes by time, but also by space, right? So so we are all interconnected, and this is like the core of sustainability, that like how our actions like impact each other. So yeah, I always realized that, like, even since I was a teenager, and you know, like any action, like I have to think about it and how it impacts people around me, and maybe even in a couple of years, not only now.
Thank you, Lena. And Chris, you lead the City of Calgary in the resilience area. Again, that to get to that position, you must have had a passion about sustainability. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you so much for the question. I'm imagining I'm cozying up in your space there with the fireplace among these other amazing people. The best part of this day will be learning about each other's passion. So I'm grateful to be asked the question. I was incredibly blessed as a young child to live in many communities across Canada, where my family traveled from place to place as a result of my father's work. And it allowed me to live in some of the most remote locations in Canada, where I learned so much about the different topography of our country, the geography of Canada, and the different ways people live within those spaces. And I was so enriched by just meeting such different people across this amazing country, the way they live with the land, the way they lived with each other, and the way they built their communities. And I think that very original opportunity to connect with others led me, like yourself, Councillor Carra, to pursue a degree at the Faculty of Environmental Design, now School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, where that was an interdisciplinary experience as well. And that just opened my mind to how important systems are and connections are. And the concept of sustainability is ensuring that all of those systems and connections can last for generations. So that's where my geeky interest in resilience and sustainability starts.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Chris. And your answer leads us perfectly into my first question for the panel. And that's about the systems and the complexity of the systems. We know that cities are this very complex systems with the high degree of interaction between all the different components, right from the built environment to the people that live and work in our cities and communities. How can we increase our sustainability while navigating this sort of complexity? And Lena, maybe you can start us off talking about that.
Yeah, so when we look at cities, like we're now more and more realizing that cities are, like we're shifting our way to see cities as physical systems to more living organisms. And when I talk about like living organisms, so for instance, when we look at the animals, like when their body size increases, they're also the rate of their metabolism like also increases. And we've finding lots of similarities also with cities. So for instance, if we increase double the population of a city, so the number of patents increased by 16%, but also the number of crimes also increased by almost the same, 15 or 16%. And this is like, you know, because like today we have so much data, and we have the opportunity to study city is different than another. So at the same time, so they have this double fate. So they hold also solutions because they act like magnets and they attract like innovations, ideas, great people. So so this is like so this is one aspect of complexity. The other aspects of complexity is looking at the micro to macro behavior. So this bottom up versus top down approach. So bottom up means like, like people in the city or businesses in the city, and top down is more like what designers want do in the city and policymakers. And whatever happens is really the interactions of these, like top down and bottom up approaches. And it's very important to understand both. So the micro level, because the micro behavior really gives emergence to what we see in the city. So for instance, it gives emergence to solutions, but also emergence to some problems. So this is why it's very important to understand the behavior aspects.
That's fabulous. Chris, can you follow up on that and talk a little bit about what your viewpoint is on that related to sustainability and resilience?
Yes, thanks very much. And much like Lena's sharing, what we're observing from a municipal lens is really the importance of looking at our systems and processes and how to be a bit more connected and efficient with our processes, creating space for understanding that very grassroots perspective, what that experience at the very ground level feels like for our community. And at the same time, navigating what can be very complex policies or directions or other orders of government, trying to help create space for innovation and for moving forward in thinking about sustainability and resilience. And so I think for a municipality, there's a real opportunity for us to create different systems. And at the city, we're looking at how to structure ourselves in a different way and use tools and innovation to communicate and engage community in participating with us, to better understand what's important to people, how their values are emerging, especially when you come out of a situation like this COVID pandemic that we're in, which really helps people to sort of stop and say, what's important to me? What do I need in my community? So resilience and sustainability is hanging on to those things that are of value to folks, but also helping us move forward so that we can capitalize on just the amazing innovation, data, information, analytics, and tools that are emerging as a result of this fascinating technological age. So sustainability is quite a very ripe and very exciting opportunity for us to think differently about our systems as a municipality, for example.
That's great. Let's move on to our next question. And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you on this one. Because of your story was really fabulous about how you came into sustainability. And the question is what role does empathy play in sustainability? We talk about this sometimes as, the power of the collective. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that. And then Giancarlo, I might follow up with you next on that one.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. I actually was kind of hoping that you'd ask me this question, something about this. One of the things I found when I was on council, it's fun because that's actually back when I met Councillor Kara. I came into it as an engineer. So imagine an engineer sitting in a political environment with a bunch of councillors. And often the things that we got put in front of us were engineering things. So I was always confused why everyone wasn't listening to my opinion. I'm like, but I'm the engineer. I read this report. I'm right. The rest of you are wrong. And I've done about 6 months of losing 6-1 every single time we had a decision in front of us. And very quickly realized that my opinion has nothing to do with it. What had to do with it is the other 6 people's opinion of what we were talking about. So when we talk about empathy, it's about listening. It's about this whole idea of we've heard forever. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. And when we talk about sustainable communities, and I've heard it a couple of times with all the other panelists, this top-down, bottom-up discussion, City of Calgary is a massive organization. How do we take these great ideas and get them down to the person who's actually has the checklist? So when I come in as a consultant with a great idea that I think matches the vision of Calgary, how does that person who's just checking the boxes buy into that same idea that their, city councillor is talking about is important to Calgary? And the way to do that is to listen. Like, what are these poor people at the front end of the gatekeepers, I like to call them? How do they buy into this larger city process? They've got a job. They're just trying to make money to bring home food for their families. And they just want to lower the amount of risk and liability. So innovation is really scary for them. And so it's really understanding everyone in that process. Where is their view and perspective in building sustainable communities? So sometimes it's really easy from my perspective. I work with a lot of developers and they also have a perspective. Like, they won't be continuing development if they can't do it economically. And often we forget that sustainability has to be also economically supportive. We talk about naturalized technology and everyone's like, well, that's because you're protecting the environment. I'm like, oh, no. We use naturalized technology because it means that I can hit both economically. We found a way to make it more cost effective for the development community. It's socially supported because the communities, the homes that get to live around this, the neighborhoods that get to live in an environment that's more naturalized than gray, they increases home prices. And now we've got something where we're attracting the bugs and bunnies and also places where families can engage with their neighborhood. And then of course it's nice because we get to hit that environmental one pretty easily, but I really like to refer to it as a value add. And so often taking that kind of step back and looking at all the values of all of the stakeholders, from the person that's going to be using at the end to the person who's just trying to get approvals through at the City of Calgary, we had to sit and listen to what everyone's bringing to the table so we can actually all buy into that larger kind of sustainable conversation. So when you say empathy, I hear right away, how are we better listening to everyone in the process? So.
Thanks, Jennifer. Giancarlo, what do you think about that?
Well, that was a great answer from Jennifer, and also great answer from Dr. Catan and Chris as well. I guess I'll just sort of build a little bit on what Jennifer said and talk about my own sort of journey as a politician over the last 11 years. I ran on a physical city building platform for 11 years called Great Neighborhoods, based on the idea that the great neighborhood is the physical cellular level building block of the project of civilization. But like Jennifer, you get involved in these complex environments and you start dealing much more with the people side. I went from, being all about planning and development to chairing community and protective services for the last 6 years and leading the inquiry into systemic racism, banning conversion therapy, things like that, where we're making significant changes on the people side of the relationship between people and place that is the project of human civilization. This election, I ran with 3 values. I sort of put great neighborhoods, which I still believe, fully to the side. And I said, there's 3 things that we need to focus on at this moment in our city and our region's history. And the first one is that we have to be an equitable and just place. We have to build a city for everyone. And we have to address issues of systemic racism. We have to address, issues of mental health and addiction, poverty, homelessness. The other thing is that if we haven't all been altered by COVID-19, if we haven't learned the lesson that COVID-19 is trying to teach us, I believe, is that we're all in this together. There is no libertarian fantasy that can sort of stand up to the reality that we are globally in this together. And the next global challenge that we have to meet together is climate action and addressing climate change. And then the final thing is, I think, getting back to, I think what a lot of people talked about here, whether you're talking about top up, bottom down, is understanding the role that a good government has to play in our collective success. And that's really about getting subsidiarity right. That's about making the right decisions at the right level. It's about understanding the relationship between a strong private sector and a strong public sector. And getting beyond, I think, the polarized debates that are paralyzing us right now about, the role that, the idea that government is bad for business. We will not survive unless we collectively act together and we assign the appropriate roles and responsibilities to the appropriate level and to the appropriate place on the spectrum between public and private. And so I think being empathetic is, as Jennifer said, meeting people where they're at, understanding their perspective, and figuring out how everyone plugs into the complex system that we need to appreciate we live in, and that we need to significantly change in order to do the heavy lifts that lie before us, and that without doing, we will not be able to survive and thrive long into an uncertain future. So this is a critical moment, and I think keeping those values of equitability and justice, climate action, and appreciating the role of governance and government as we tackle this together is so critical.
Thanks so much, Giancarlo. Your answer leads beautifully into our next question from our audience. And just a reminder to our audience, if you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many as we can this morning. So our question comes from Wiley, and Chris, I'm going to get you to start on this one. The question is what is the largest challenge you face while engaging with the public and communities with sustainability? And how do you overcome these challenges?
Well, that's a very comprehensive question, Riley. Thank you for that. What is the greatest challenge we face? I think part of it for us is really making sure that we're creating opportunities to actually gather multiple points of view and gather multiple perspectives. The city's becoming, as Councillor Carra has indicated, incredibly focused on ensuring that we are creating space to hear many voices. And that the historic ways of making decisions and systems that we use to make decisions, we're actually challenging from even within. And so I think from a perspective of engaging with community, it's finding different methodologies to engage with different pockets of our community, creating space for the single mom with the 2 kids to have that opportunity to have a voice, creating space for new members to our community, Indigenous members of our community. And when I say creating space, I also think I mean using different ways and manners to reach with people. So I think there's some creativity required to really understand what people hold as value. We also have some historic systems and processes that we use, such as our citizen satisfaction surveys. We have new members of council who just finished a very rigorous campaign, and we're working closely with our council members to hear what did you hear on the campaign trail, and how can that help us shape direction going forward? What's important to our community? Our council members are a fantastic resource to help the city to understand what's important. So I think it's just using different methodologies, and as I mentioned before, finding different ways to reach our community. The COVID-19 pandemic really helped all of us transition into this very virtual platform and way of existing with one another. And that's actually created some opportunity for those who in the past may not have had the physical capability to attend, for example, a council session or participate in an engagement session with the city. That's created an opening and an opportunity to hear from some of those folks as well. So to the question, I think the greatest challenge we have is making sure that we're creating those moments for collecting those points of view. And then also, what do we do with them? How do those points of view help fulfill us understanding where to go with policy direction, or what decisions to make around the way we use our spaces, the way we support in local economy, and the way that we represent and embrace different cultural views. So that would be my top of the mind response to Riley's question. Thank you.
That's great, Chris. Thanks. That was a perfect answer. Really appreciate that. It ties into our next question that was asked by Tim, and I'm going to shorten it up just a little bit, Tim. And I'm going to direct this one to Lena to start with. And Tim says, I can imagine similar versions of this excellent conversation being held in the thousands of cities around the world. And how do we reconcile the importance of local conversation with action on the world scale to avert the planet's demise? So Lena, perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about how do we take what we're doing locally and what are we how do we bring it to the international scale? Or how does what we do locally even affect the international scale? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, so going back to the idea that with complexity, we're really all connected. So we're connected, even from local to global. So for instance, Like when you buy, like today, when you buy anything, it was in somewhere else in the world, right? Like it was either in China or fabricated. So, you know, like we are all connected. So anything even we take at the local level, it also impacts, you know, like people living in other part of the world. And we have to look beyond short-term interest and gain, and really like try to like empower our communities. So if we really like look at, you know, like empowering our communities and making our communities stronger, like we start at the local level. And then if everybody thinks the same, I think we can like really together, by working together and in collaboration, we can really bring the solutions to the global level. So yeah, I mean, there's no small action or individual action being small. And we have seen with COVID, and especially when at the start of the lockdown, how we can collectively really, we are very powerful, like even impacting the climate and the quality of air, right? So there are lots of lessons that we can learn from the pandemic, and we can steer them to solve our problems today. Innovations is very important. And I think working together and steering innovation to good purpose, not just like innovation for the sake of innovation, but innovations for, you know, like steering them to for our collective good is very important.
Thanks, Lena. Those small changes make a big difference, don't they? Now, our next question comes from Frank, and he's asking about the role of an engineer. So he's saying one of the primary responsibilities of an engineer is to protect the general public. And he said, are we not at the point where we need to be actively working to reverse climate change? And is that not part of our ethical duty to protect the public? And this gets into it's a really interesting question, because what is our ethical duty as an engineer? And are we looking to protect the public from themselves sometimes? It's a complex question. Jennifer, do you want to try to kick us off on that one?
Absolutely. You know what? This is a big one when we're thinking about like civil engineering. I always talk. My other half of my family is a mechanical engineer, and work with a lot of electrical and all these different roles. And one of the things I remember, we were doing a big park recently that we've got all these people on, and we had an electrical issue, and I'm calling this electrical engineer, and I go, you know, like, this is a big issue, like I got to get this running. And he's like, you know, I would never want to be a civil engineer. You know, when things don't work in the electrical world, we just like unplug it and plug it back in. But you civil engineers, you get one shot, and everything else after that is really difficult, really expensive. And so what it does is it puts civil engineers in an interesting position that we're always like, the root of what we should be doing is looking at that systems approach. Because if we haven't taken in all of those perspectives, we put ourselves in a lot more risk than the risk we think we're walking into by doing the cookie cutter approach that we've done for the last 100 years. Recently, someone was saying to me, civil engineering, we still do pipes the same way we did 100 years ago. Like, compare that to flight. Where were we 100 years ago when it came to flight? But somehow in civil engineering, we're still putting the same types of pipes in the ground the way we did 100 years ago. So I think there's lots of opportunity from an engineer's perspective to say, like, yes, there's a lot of liability in there. And I remember in the engineering degree, they always tell us, like, a doctor kills one person at a time. I make a mistake, I can kill thousands, right? So that ethical responsibility is really big. But what we've done in the last 5 years, I think, with the group that I've attracted at Magna, which I think is not surprisingly that half of us are under the age of 30, because looking at how children look at the sustainability point, but where the climate comes in, where sustainability comes in, they get it way better than we do, right? Like, my kids are the recyclers in my household better than we are, right? Convenience was the story of the day when I was going through school in the 80s and 90s, whereas now it's not, it's about responsibility. So I think that really what it is for engineers, and it probably sounds like a gong, but you can hear all of us saying it, but it's really listening to all aspects of it. So how do I convince a community that I'm building this infrastructure for, that it's good for them and good for the climate? Well, maybe I need to help them understand how these decisions are good for their grandchildren. right? That today in this moment, it's inconvenient for them to make this choice. It's inconvenient to walk to the store. So we want bigger roads so more people can drive on it. But at some point in time, we actually want our grandchildren to be able to ride the tricycle, or our teenagers to be able to run over and grab milk because they can jump on a bike and get it. And I think families understand that. So I use the family analogy a lot when I talk about what climate impact is. You know, we can talk about the global crisis, but what they hear in their heart is, what is the world you want your children to grow up in? And what do you want for that community? And it's like climate becomes a value add. So I don't have to convince them to believe in climate change. I need to convince them to build these sustainable communities. And in the background, I'm saying, we took care of climate change at the same time. So that's really the way that I think that that's the best way that engineers can approach this, is more that kind of systems approach. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Chris, do you want to follow up on that one?
Yeah, I really, really do. Jennifer, you're so inspiring to hear that there's that microcosm of discussion around the role of the engineer. And I wanted to add that because of our work in the resilience strategy as well, one of the pillars of our resilience strategy really talks about infrastructure. And we looked at infrastructure both from the built lens as well as the natural asset lens, and starting to, as a city, quantify and qualify what natural assets do in their role as infrastructure to help us with climate change and climate differences. And further to that, we actually had council approve 6 capital infrastructure investment principles in 2015 and in 2018 again, which really looks at the multiple benefits of our infrastructure investments. And it's things like, how do we optimize our infrastructure? How do we support our city services, which is the role of infrastructure with the city? How do we promote the well-being of communities, the environment, and the economy as part of the criteria for our infrastructure projects? How are we helping ensure our infrastructure is building an adaptable and resilient city and a smart city, so that we can create accommodation for technology and innovation? And then how are we making sure that we're ensuring the long-term value of those assets and how our assets can reach multiple benefits? So for example, the Eau Claire flood berm that we created, which is both a flood mitigation barrier, it's a pathway system, it's a natural enhancement. We created it using bioactivity to increase bioactivity and reserve along the water systems for flora and fauna and water health. So I really appreciate that thinking at the level with the engineer, because we're trying to translate that up into what it means to make decisions as a city. Sorry, Jocelyn, I just wanted to jump in. I got excited about that.
That is absolutely perfect. And this is between Jennifer and Chris. I really appreciate it because you're providing the 2 different viewpoints, which is exactly what we're hoping to get on this panel. And it leads us so beautifully into our next question, which comes from Don. And he's talking about the different viewpoints of a time scale. And Giancarlo, I'm going to start with you on this one. And what Don asks is, he's asking about the transition between what happens is we want to make changes very quickly to moving to a time scale where we realize that it takes a long time to make things happen. And in particular, Giancarlo, in your role, you have these 4-year chunks, but you've managed to stack them. So I think you'll have a good appreciation of the time scale. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think I love what Jennifer said about having to take a systems approach. And then I guess I would sort of agree with that completely and say that we also have to take a scaled approach and understand that everything happens at different scales. And one of those scales is the time scale. And then the other scale is really sort of that bottom up to top down approach that Dr. Katan was talking about. And I threw out the word subsidiarity because that's one of the ideas that's sort of emergent in the new urbanism about where do you make the right decision, who makes the decision regarding what thing at what scale, and then what's the time frame on that as well. And so I think taking a systems approach is critical, but also taking a scaled approach is the next step towards being able to solve that. I wish that Rome was built in a day. I wish that you could snap your fingers and build the sustainable world that we live in. But we know that, the systems that we live within have taken decades to spool up And we are looking at the world through a much different lens in terms of our values. And it's going to take decades more to spool up other systems. And so the question is really about, where do we make the decisions? And so I guess you got to get fourth dimensional with it as you talk about time and space and volume, and think about that within that systems approach. So I don't know if that really sort of solves the question. I will tell you that, for myself, great neighborhoods make a great city was the rallying cry for 11 years. It's a 5-point transformation I've been pursuing through 3, now 4 terms of work at the City of Calgary. And these changes are fundamental and they're underway, but they are fragile and they're emergent and they take time. And, my decision to run for a 4th term was because I saw that we were reaching an existential moment where the last 11 years of work could have gone out the window in a bonfire of change. And I wanted to be there to sort of, provide a steady tether to what we've been doing for 11 years, because we really started to change the City of Calgary, with the election of Mayor Nenshi 11 years ago, and beginning to talk about the city as not a suburban growth machine, but as a city of great sustainable networked neighborhoods, networked by sustainable infrastructures, a change of how we grow from sort of that monocentric automobile function to that polycentric, multimodal approach. These are all critical things that take a long time to change. And being able to keep your eye on the prize is critical. And how do you do that across election cycles, which, as you said, are so short? The other thing that we have as a problem is that, the act of getting elected requires an entire suite of skills that have very little to do with the job that you get on the back end. The act of campaigning and the act of governing are almost antithetical to each other, and they're very disconnected. And what we're finding is that we are increasingly training politicians. We're increasingly training politicians to, sorry, my phone just rang, and good, it doesn't seem like I was interrupted. We're training politicians to become experts at campaigning, which makes them less and less skilled at the job they're campaigning for, which is governing, which has to take a longer viewpoint. So, I think there are some heavy lifts we need to do. There are some fundamental shifts we need to make now that we understand that our values are different, and we have to understand that across scale and across system. And I'll stop ranting at that point.
Thank you so much, Giancarlo. It's wonderful to, it's great to hear about the different perspectives, the systems and the different scales and the different pulls that we have on things. As we kind of move into the last parts of our panel, I'm going to finish up with kind of 2 questions that I'm actually going to get a quick response from each of our panelist members. And I have a question from Anna that I think everybody has struggled with at some point in time. And I'm hoping you can give me just a quick, 30-second response to this one from each of our panelists. And the question is, as future engineers, city planners, and policymakers with increased impacts of climate change, should we either invest in new resilient infrastructure technology, or should we adapt our existing infrastructure? And it's a question, do you build a new house that meets all of these requirements, or do you fix up an old house? And I'm going to start with Lena, who can maybe talk about it from the transportation perspective, but then I'm going to go to each of you for just kind of a quick shot answer on this one. Lena, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, there's not a single answer for this one. So this decision is different for, I think ideally what we should be doing, retrofitting our infrastructure to be more sustainable and to rely more on sustainable resources. And what is really important is that infrastructure cannot be looked at in isolation. So we cannot look, for instance, at transportation in isolation with other infrastructure. There are lots of, we're moving more towards a world of integration where we can do infrastructure symbiosis. So a solution for one infrastructure can also benefit another infrastructure. And the other idea is decentralization. I think it's very, very important. So for instance, we see in McCamey Library that we have built, it's an infrastructure that is somehow self-sustainable on itself. So it generates its own power, it recycles its own water. So I think like we should be heading this way.
Fabulous, Lena. Christine, what do you want to add to that?
I very much agree with you, Lena, and I very much support the concepts of circular economy, investing in retrofitting, use our new technology and our new ways of just creating things that can help us with taking what we have and optimizing what we have. We spend a lot of time looking at what to invest in for life cycle and operating at the city over the life cycle of an asset. How can we make assets more modular? How can we make them adaptive to different uses? The platform parkade / future office and co-creation center is a great example of thinking about longer term what an investment in an asset can look like. So for me, we have some incredible built structure and built environment in Calgary. I really hope we're using all these new brains and bright young minds and that focus on resilience and sustainability to help us say, how can we make the most and optimize what we have? That's my humble opinion.
Fabulous. Thanks, Chris. Giancarlo, I'm going to go to you next.
Well, I completely agree with the comments from both Dr. Catan and Chris Arthurs. And I'll just add, I think, the provocative statement that we're going to have to triage, right? There are going to be things that we can adapt and we're designed to adapt. And unfortunately, the story of city building for the last 7 to 8 decades, the post-war era was about building non-complex systems that were not adaptable. And there is a whole school of work in terms of sprawl repair. How do you retrofit the automobile habitat to be the more complex human habitat of the city? The transit-oriented development is really about that. There are going to be places where we retrofit and adapt, and there are going to be some places that I think 50 years from now represent significant liabilities that have nothing to do with how we live, how we want to live, how we can live on the planet. And, they represent long-term liabilities. And I think at some point we're going to have to be bloody minded about what we can retrofit and then what we have to abandon, what we have to build new so that it can adapt. And I think adaptability sort of sits at the center of that. But I think it's a great question. And I think there's some really tough work in the years ahead as we shift, as we build an environment that reflects our shifted values and a more robust understanding of the ecological circumstance that we find ourselves in. And so great question. And that is the challenge of the years ahead in city building and the general project of human civilization.
Thanks, Giancarlo. And Jennifer, I'm going to let you give the last word on this one.
So in 30 seconds, I'm going to bring up the controversial topic. So what we do is build naturalized systems. So natural assets is a really interesting conversation around this discussion around, do we improve? Do we build new? Do we retrofit? And I think it's funny, I was looking at my clock. It took 46 minutes and Dr. Catan had used the word integration. And I thought, it's about that. It's about the integration. So the cheetah response to this is both. We both need to build new in the sense that we need to put down old ideas and say, what happened if we just started a conversation with a blank slate, didn't bring all the intentions and all the baggage that came to decision-making to got us to where we are. Now, we can't ignore it. History is super, super important. But that's the thought process, I think, is the new thought process. But in answer to the question, I think it's really important to look at the existing infrastructure for that kind of engineering function discussion around natural asset, wetlands. The whole debate around, do we not touch wetlands? And I have an office full of biologists and environmental engineers that said, yes, we should touch them, because if we don't pay attention to playing the tape to the end, to what they look like after development and communities have grown around them, after families have used them, after communities have used them, what is the final intent? And sometimes that means that we're going to integrate wetlands into our infrastructure, which means they're not going to look the same that they did 100 years ago. And the reason they aren't is because the development around them doesn't look the same. And there's this big picture. But it's scary to say that. I'm not going to use your natural wetland, but can I intentionally build you a natural infrastructure asset in its place? Can I integrate it so that we're not building engineering beside a wetland? How about we're looking at a whole integrated park scenario, that whole systems things? How do we want people using the wetland? And so what can we be doing in that? And we have to be really cautious because that's the baby in the bathwater. Oh, so we're going to eradicate natural wetlands. And be really careful not to let that happen. Don't jump over the cliff. Get really close to the edge of talking about what it looks like to restore a natural environment so that it's usable for the community, but not jump over the cliff where we're just roofing and paving through our natural assets. So I think it's a big conversation to have. So I was going to drop that one on there. And back to you, Jocelyn.
Thanks so much. So to wrap things up today, I would like to just finish with your final words. And we've heard a lot about the complexity of the system, that it is a system, that everything is integrated, the living organism, everything affects everything else. So I'm wondering if each of you can provide, we've got a bunch of people listening today. What can we do? We hear about this idea of the butterfly effect. One small change makes a big difference. What can we do as an individual to affect change towards sustainability? And I'm wondering, Chris, if we can start with you on this one. What can we do at the individual level today? What can people go away and do differently?
I think what's important is to know that you have the power to make a difference. And I know that sounds cliche, but I think it's very true. And you mentioned early on, Jocelyn, that I had a role in designing our emergency management system for Calgary, which I did. But where I went from there actually was to turn my focus to resilience and sustainability. And it was because our emergency management system is brilliant. It's designed to help us run forward into the emergency when it's happening. But I want everyone on the call to know that you can be part of the emergency management system by taking effort before there's an emergency. You have the ability to do that. So even it's a small change, like choosing to ride your bike, like Councillor Croft, or choosing to be invested in infrastructure systems like yourself, Dr. Katan, or yourself, Jennifer, inspiring an entire office of people to think differently about infrastructure. Those are acts of bravery and acts of change. And so whatever you choose with your career through this program, I think it's really important to know you have a role to play.
I love that. It's a really inspiring message, Chris. Thank you. Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to tell the story of what got me into politics, and it's a pretty quick one. But I was involved with a lot of anti-human trafficking kind of social work before I decided to join politics. And it was someone from Advocacy Canada that said to me, right, we get caught up in how to change the world in these really macro ideas, but the reality is your family is the start. It's this tiny little petri dish. And if everyone in your family can understand climate and sustainability and these things, like that little group of people are going to inspire everyone else. And when I decided to run for politics, Chestermere was 15,000 people. And I said, I wanted to prove to my family that if I could change the mind of 15,000 people, those 15,000 people have this larger network, and it's this huge amount of ripple effect. So when people say, and I love it, the idea that we can't change it, it's like the whole starfish story, right? Like I can save this one by throwing it back in the ocean. If you don't know about the starfish story, look, you should Google it. But the reality is, politics, your neighborhood community, like there are boards and volunteer groups crying out for any of us to give an hour or so of our time. And in that, we learn about kind of the intricacies of how these things affect us personally. So getting our kids inspired because we volunteered in a community event, so they can volunteer in that community event, picking up garbage along the river. Like it's crazy watching a couple of kids, how exciting they are to take a garbage bag and go clean up down the river. And then that's the thing that they invite their friends to next year. So how can people get started? Honestly, look at that tiny little circle of influence you have and give it the value it deserves to know that it's the tiny ripple, the butterfly effect that changes the world.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I love that answer. Giancarlo.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on the very excellent answers from both Chris and Jennifer, I mean, I'll just point to my own story as well. Like I was a student at the University of Calgary talking about East Calgary neighborhoods with East Calgary neighborhoods. And I became a city councilor to take a lot of the visions that we had sort of developed together and make them a reality. So, you know, my master's thesis in the Faculty of Environmental Design is a $180 million built project. It's the Max Purple line up into and the rebuild of International Avenue. And this was work that was done in community with community, and now it's a built form. And I can point to just so many projects over my 11 years of being a city councilor where student work, where community work, where the intersection between that and conversations about like having a different and better relationship between people, between parts of the city with other parts of the city are transforming the city. You know, the Green Line, you look at everything that we love about our city, the river pathway system, you know, these were all decisions that were made by people like you, students, community leaders, and they have changed the world and they've shaped the world that we live in. And so I just want to say that, you know, I agree with Jennifer. There are so many things that we need to do in our city, in our community, and there are so many ways to plug in. And if you stick with it and you build relationships, you will change the relationship of your part of the city with the rest of the city, with your city, with the rest of the world, which is really what the ultimate project of saving the planet in the face of climate change is all about. So, I mean, it's just get out there, roll up your sleeves and start working with people to apply what you know and to the circumstances that every part of the city is faced with, and you can make amazing change. And we're setting up a city that will be incredibly responsive to those conversations.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Lena.
Yeah. So yeah, as an educator, I believe the most effective way to really impact the mind of future generation and future leaders is through education and teaching. So this year I started teaching this interdisciplinary course where we look at things, you know, like we look at cities and how cities are, you know, like how the problems that cities are facing right now and how we get there. So try to learn like lessons from the past and question things that we have, like look beyond GDP, look at, you know, like how other measures we can, you know, like understand cities. So yeah, I think, and the most important part in this course is that, like I always tell students, we have to think about the impact of our actions over space and over time. And I think this is really very important in terms of sustainability and in terms of climate change, right? Like our actions now impacts, you know, like things in the future and also across space. Also, in my role as a parent, I'm always like, we are all as parents, we are also teachers, and we can teach our kids at the very young age, as Jennifer said, and how our actions are like vote, right? Like whenever you decide like what to shop, like where to shop and what to buy, what to eat, it's really impacts things locally, but also globally.
Thank you, Lena. I think this is the perfect spot to end the conversation and get into the final formalities of today's events. I want to thank all of our panelists for an engaging, exciting, and insightful and really empowering conversation today. That's the piece I think I liked the most, is just how empowering all of your answers were for all of us to get out there and do something around the sustainability piece. So thank you to all of you, and a big appreciation to our audience. And now I'm going to turn it back over to our Dean, Bill Rosehart, for some final closing remarks. Bill.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for hosting what has been a really outstanding discussion today. And thank you to the panelists for sharing your insights and your expertise. And of course, thank you to everyone in attendance for joining us and staying connected to the University of Calgary and the Schulich School of Engineering. We hope you've enjoyed yourself and valued the insights provided by our panelists. I also hope that you'll consider joining us for our next Schulich Connects, which is scheduled for November 25th and is entitled The Digital Future Today: Stay tuned to your email and social media communications for more information about that session. Until then, thank you again for joining today's Schulich Connect, and take care.